Okay, now, let's deal with abortion. 40 million abortions since Roe v. Wade. You know, as a pastor, I have to deal with this all the time. All of the pain and all the conflicts. I know this is a very complex issue. 40 million abortions. At what point does a baby get human rights, in your view?
Well, you know, I think that whether you're looking at it from a theological perspective or a scientific perspective, answering that question with specificity, you know, is above my pay grade. But let me just speak more generally about the issue of abortion, because this is something obviously the country wrestles with. One thing that I'm absolutely convinced of is that there is a moral and ethical element to this issue. And so I think anybody who tries to deny the moral difficulties and gravity of the abortion issue, I think, is not paying attention. So that'd be point number one. But point number two, I am pro-choice. I believe in Roe versus Wade, and I come to that conclusion not because I'm pro-abortion, but because ultimately I don't think women make these decisions casually. I think they wrestle with these things in profound ways, in consultation with their pastors or their spouses or their doctors and their family members. And so for me, the goal right now should be, and this is where I think we can find common ground, and by the way, I've now inserted this into the Democratic Party platform, is how do we reduce the number of abortions? Because the fact is that although we've had a president who's opposed to abortion over the last 8 years, abortions have not gone down.
And that was the winning statement for me. Now, it's not a perfect statement, and indeed some bishops of my church still insist I'm headed to Gehenna because that's not sufficient. For the church teaches that you must constantly work to prohibit this as a matter of law, as well as work to reduce it as a matter of culture. My proposition, this starts to get very theological in a very Catholic way, so I'll avoid it unless you really want to get into it, and we can do it afterwards for those who do. My proposition is that the effort to solve, quote unquote, the abortion dilemma through law has been a notable failure. That the Supreme Court is just kind of stuck at a point where it's not going anywhere else. And even if John McCain had been elected and he had the power then to appoint another person to the court, it first of all is not, in my judgment, a fifth vote, because I don't think he can count up to 4 yet on the present court. And even if it was a fifth vote, it would have just returned the issue to the states, where California would have been entirely pro-choice. We know that as a matter of public policy. Indiana would have been pro-life, and so the states would have then differed in terms of their position. It would not have led to, for Catholic theologian possibilities, the absolute protection of human life from the first moment of conception. So that then led to an element of proportionate reasoning that Senator Obama met by saying, I want to reduce the number of abortions, and the way to do that is by addressing the cause of those abortions. And we know that women in poverty are 4 times more likely to have an abortion than a woman not in poverty. And so don't we think that if we provide decent health care and decent shelter and decent maternity leave and an adoption process that is not overly cumbersome and expensive, but welcoming and encouraging and dignified, that in fact we will have that positive result? That's what he wrote into the platform. That's what I think his basis on common ground is.
And let's give Professor Jones a chance to address this.
Okay.
First of all, I was very encouraged to hear a Democratic presidential candidate making faith a central part of his rhetoric. No, he has really done so more than any candidate since Jimmy Carter on the Democratic side. Walter Mondale, son of a Methodist minister, did not talk about his faith. Dukakis did not. Clinton did a little bit. And I believe there is a spiritual side, genuinely a spiritual side to Bill Clinton, but he was not nearly as overt about it as Barack Obama. He talks about our fallenness. He talks about how there are moral solutions as well as policy solutions to the upheavals and ills that we suffer. And I think that is a very positive thing. With regard to the issue of abortion, I guess I would not make a very good politician. I would have personally, and I have friends that disagree with me vehemently, but I would have a very hard time being personally or religiously one thing, but politically something else. I am opposed to abortion with a couple of exceptions, but I recognize that it is a complicated issue. We are dealing with a clash of two values that Americans esteem most highly. One is the value of human life. The second is individual liberty. And so which one, when they conflict, when they are seemingly at loggerheads, do we privilege over the other? That's a tough one. For me, the answer is pretty clear. But for one who holds President Obama's position, I think he did about the best job you can rhetorically with that, which is to search for common ground. Regardless of which side we stand on, all of us want to see the number of abortions reduced. All of us want to see adoptions made easier. All of us want to see a reduction in teenage pregnancies. All of us want to deal with the root cause of that. And I think he does a good job of bringing people together as best you can around some goals that you have in common. Whenever you disagree with someone, you always start with where you agree, with what you have in common. Then we can talk about the areas where we differ. I think he does a pretty good job of that.
Let me just ask Professor Kmiec to comment on the following. It's maybe ironic that even as we speak, Barack Obama may be signing an order which would allow federal money to be going to fund abortions around the world. It doesn't strike me that that's the way to reduce the number of abortions. The Democratic platform has said they want to make abortions safe, legal, and rare. But if you're funding it through federal tax dollars around the world and very likely going to fund abortions within the United States with the possible rejection of the Hyde Amendment, it seems to me that's likely to increase the number of abortions.
Well, here I'll give you President Obama's answer. Believe me, I'm quite aware of what's going on today. What's going on today is a repeal of the so-called Mexico City policy, which was a prohibition of federal funds from going to international NGOs, non-governmental organizations that counsel for abortion or refer for abortion. Notice that the prohibition, the Mexico City prohibition, was a prohibition that said if your organization uses your money from other sources to counsel for abortion or to refer for abortion, you're not going to get any federal money from us, even if what you're doing is providing health care in an impoverished village of the most basic sort that's not related to abortion. So the first thing that Senator Obama said to me when I made the argument you just made about why don't you retain the Mexico City policy was it's overbroad. If basically you want to target, you want to say you're not going to use federal dollars to advance abortion, that's different from taking federal funding from an organization that uses its own resources to do that, but is otherwise providing general health care to an impoverished population. So he has that kind of first level of argument. But he actually goes deeper than that. And his second level of argument is to say didn't I just tell you I was you're not listening, Professor Kmiec. Yeah, didn't I just tell you I was pro-choice? In the sense that I believe that a woman has to have a fair, even-handed choice to choose in one direction or another. And so I'm not going to draw discriminations, he will say, between one side of that equation and another, because if I draw those discriminations, if I fund only the pro-life side of the equation and then I put my thumb on that scale and not respected the judgment of the woman, if I fund only the pro-abortion side, then I've put my thumb on that side of the scale. So he's got a non-discrimination argument going on in his head when it comes to that proposition.
And did you find his argument convincing?
No, and because, of course, anything you fund, you get more of. My response was to say, this is, you can redraw the Mexico City policy to allow those funds to go for generalized health care and take care of your first problem without implicating any of the rest of this. But that's not the course he's chosen to take, which is a difference between us. But that doesn't mean the common ground doesn't exist. The common ground of reducing abortion in terms of addressing teenage pregnancy, in terms of addressing women in poverty, in terms of addressing maternity care and adoption, all still exists. And I made the judgment that in light of those pledges and the balance of the faith, the balance of the social gospel, which, in my judgment, has been knocked off the table far too long by this single issue, that when you say that you're interested in protecting life from the moment of natural conception to the moment of death, it means every moment in between. It means that young child who's born to a family who has no nutrition and no health care and dies within that first year. It means that you're going to deal with the situation that you've got an economic environment in which working families have been greatly disadvantaged by the tax and economic structure than the most affluent. It means that you have a commitment to immigrants who are within your community who are exploited year after year by virtue of the fact that the law doesn't protect them in terms of their working relationships. Obama has all of those other things that he talks about, and each one of those things is rooted in the social gospel. And to say that you just ignore all of those things in light of the imperfection of his decisions on this score seemed to me to be the wrong calculus.
And with that, we'll move to Obama's discussion of civil discourse, which of course is closely related to this issue, since this is the issue that many within our country not speaking to one another.
No matter how religious they may be or may not be, people are tired of seeing faith used as a tool of attack. They don't want faith used to belittle or to divide. They are tired of people who deliver more screed than sermon. Because in the end, that's not how they think about faith in their own lives. So let me end with just one other interaction I had during my campaign. A few days after I won the Democratic nomination in my U.S. Senate race, I get this email from a doctor at the University of Chicago Medical School, and the email said the following, quote, "Congratulations on your overwhelming and inspiring primary win. I was happy to vote for you, and I will tell you that I'm seriously considering voting for you in the general election. I write to express my concerns that may, in the end, prevent me from supporting you." The doctor then described himself as a Christian who understood his commitments as, and I quote, totalizing. His faith led him to a strong opposition to abortion and gay marriage, although he said that his faith also led him to question the idolatry of the free market the quick resort to militarism, the unwillingness to attend to the issues of poverty that seem to characterize much of the Republican agenda. But the reason the doctor was considering not voting for me was not simply the fact that I was pro-choice. Rather, he had read an entry that my campaign had posted on my website, which suggested that I would fight, quote, and this was language that was on my website at the time, quote, right-wing ideologues who want to take away a woman's right to choose, unquote. And so the doctor went on to write, quote, I sense that you have a strong sense of justice. I also sense that you are a fair-minded person with a high regard for reason. Whatever your convictions, if you truly believe that those who oppose abortions are all ideologues driven by the perverse desire to inflict suffering on women, then you, in my judgment, are not fair-minded. You know that we enter times that are fraught with possibilities for good and for harm, times when we are struggling to make sense of a common polity in the context of plurality, that we are unsure of what grounds we have for making any claims that involve others. I do not speak at this point, I do not ask at this point that you oppose abortion, only that you speak about this issue in fair-minded words. Fair-minded words. I looked at my website. I had, my staff had put this up, and I checked it, and I found the offending words. My staff, in fairness to them, they had written that boilerplate because it was standard Democratic boilerplate. It described my position during the Democratic primary at a time when some of my opponents were questioning my commitment to protect Roe versus Wade. So rereading the doctor's letter, though, I felt a pang of shame. Because it's people like him who are looking for a deeper, fuller conversation about religion in this country. They may not change their positions, I may not change my position, but they're willing to listen and learn from those who are willing to speak in fair-minded words. Those who know the central and awesome place that God holds in the lives of so many, and who refuse to treat faith as simply another political issue with which to score points. So I wrote back to the doctor, and I thanked him for his advice. And the next day I circulated the email to my staff with the words, fair-minded words underlined. And I changed the language on the website to state in clear but simple terms my pro-choice position. And then a prayer that I might extend the same presumption of good faith to others that the doctor had extended to me. And so I say a prayer every night. It's a prayer that I think I share with a lot of Americans. I hope that we can live with one another in a way that reconciles the beliefs of each with the good of all. It's a prayer worth praying and a conversation worth having in this country in the months and years to come, and all.
And I'm going to play one more clip, and then we'll get our friends to comment on it.
Which existing Supreme Court justice would you not have nominated?
That's a good one. I would not have nominated Clarence Thomas. I don't think that I don't think that he was a strong enough jurist or legal thinker at the time for that elevation. Setting aside the fact that I profoundly disagree with his interpretations of a lot of the Constitution. I would not nominate Justice Scalia, although I don't think there's any doubt about his intellectual brilliance, because he and I just disagree. He taught at the University of Chicago, as did I, in the law school.
How about John Roberts?
You know, John Roberts, I have to say, was a tougher question only because I find him to be a very compelling person, you know, in conversation, individual. He's clearly smart, very thoughtful. I will tell you that how I've seen him operate since he went to the bench confirms this opinion I had and the reason that I voted against him. And I'll give you one very specific instance, and this is not a stump speech.
All right.
I think one of the...
When I picked this up, it means...
Right, exactly. I'm getting accused. I'm getting accused. One of the most important jobs of, I believe, the Supreme Court is to guard against the encroachment of the executive branch on the power of the other branches.
Okay.
And I think that he has been a little bit too willing and eager to give a administration, whether it's mine or George Bush's, more power than I think the Constitution originally intended.
Okay.
Let's give John a chance to comment on anything that's gone on since you last spoke.
Okay. Excuse me. On the first clip, President Obama shares this same story in his autobiography, The Audacity of Hope. And when I first read that, I was very moved by it. It's encouraging, first of all, to hear a politician once in a while say, you know what, I was wrong about something. You don't hear that every day. And here's a person who is willing to say, you know, this could have been worded differently. That was not the most respectful tone. And I appreciate that very much. And the emphasis on civil discourse, being able to sit down and talk to people with whom you disagree. Now, Obama was criticized severely, and though I didn't vote for him, I think unjustly, for saying that he would be willing to sit down and talk with our enemies. And I remember when the criticisms were going on, I thought, my goodness, when is it ever a bad thing to talk to somebody? You know, I'm more concerned about what someone will say in that conversation than the process of sitting down and actually engaging in dialogue. Things are pretty bad right now in terms of mudslinging. Both sides tend to caricature each other, misrepresent each other to the point that it just gets out of control sometimes. And the ugliness with which some of the dialogue has taken place is terribly disturbing. It hasn't always been that way. Now, at times it has been worse, but at times it has been much better. A generation or so ago, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who disagreed on almost everything, could be political enemies, but at the end of the day, they could go and have lunch together or have dinner together and be friends. And they would even joke about how, you know, before 6 o'clock we're enemies, but after 6 we're friends. And we can actually talk to one another and work through our differences and come to some understanding. And I am eager to see those times again. I'm eager to see a different spirit when we discuss vital issues of the day. There was several years ago, Richard Nixon in his inaugural address said these words, "We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another, until we speak quietly enough so that our words can be heard as well as our voices." And I think that's very relevant for our time as well. On the issue of abortion, I think I've said about all I can say.
Of course, one of the challenging notions is that the last time I heard a president strongly advocate civil discourse, say that his administration was going to hopefully bring a change to Washington was 8 years ago when George Bush came into office. Professor Kmiec, comments on the Supreme Court nominees that we're likely to get from President Obama?
Well, first off, you know, I campaigned for Senator Obama, and so I was a quote-unquote surrogate. Surrogates are supposed to more or less represent the ideas of Senator Obama, and he was greatly amused when I gave a press statements and taking him to task for his criticism of Justice Thomas, saying it was wrong-headed and seriously mistaken. So when I was on the campaign trail advocating people to vote for him, I was saying, vote for my guy, he's seriously mistaken about his appraisal of Justice Clarence Thomas. I think, with all due respect to the Reverend Warren, who I have great respect for, and I think that program was conducted with excellence, this was its low point. A question that basically says, tell me who you want to criticize. Tell me who you least admire, is a question that goes for the base in us rather than asks us to find the good in others. And it was especially troubling to me as a constitutionalist because it seemed to me that it was inviting denigration of an institution which takes its own denigration far too often for other reasons. And in particular with Justice Thomas, I think it was wrong, and just in terms of the quality of the man who demonstrated that quality when he visited with us just a few months ago. It also was troubling because it elided past one of the issues that Senator Obama takes up in his book that relates to abortion, that relates to who gets appointed to the court. And that is, are there things in this life that we know are true? Are there things that we know are self-evidently true? Can we say that about anything? Senator Obama at one point in his book said his understanding of democracy was that it set aside the proposition that anything was certainly true, that absolutism was set aside. And in place of absolutism, we substituted discourse, constitutional discussion. And for the most part, it seems to me that that's right, except that it can't all be up for grabs. And Senator Obama, in his book, recognizes that the Supreme Court made its greatest error in our history, of course, in Dred Scott, when it read people out of the Constitution and our polity on the basis of race. And that leads Senator Obama to say he is deprived of even the certainty of uncertainty. And that is the nature of the human condition, and his recognition of the difficulty of knowledge is in and of itself an exhibit of a fine mind. To answer your specific question about who he will appoint to the court, he has said, of course, people of integrity, of course, people of competence, of course, people of fair-mindedness, preparation, but also of empathy, of people who understand what it means to the liberty of the person at stake, what it means to the property interests of the person at stake, what it means to, and he always gives this as an example, Lily Ledbetter to be told that because she was discriminated against long ago when she first got her job at Goodyear on the basis of gender, that the fact, a narrow interpretation of the civil rights law that precluded her from bringing that cause of action when she discovered it years later after it had magnified through the payment of her salary. A decision that precluded that cause of action was an example of a justice who, when the law was ambiguous, when the statute could have been interpreted either way, chose to deliberately interpret it against the human person, against the civil rights of the individual, rather than in favor of it. So I think the primary quality that he will look for is someone who has that empathy. And let me, if I can, just end with that as a proposition. And I think, Professor, you mentioned that quality of his being able to see someone else's perspective as well. In our faith meeting in the summer, Franklin Graham said to him, in the middle of the meeting, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life? Was this a pop quiz? And of course, he had a theological point he was making with the emphasis on the word the way. And Senator Obama responded twice, no, he's my way. And Graham said, no, why isn't he the way? Obama said, look, I was brought up in a household without faith, and yet the person who was the most faith-filled in my life was my mother, who was greatly frustrated with me when I couldn't understand another person's position, and who taught me to see from the perspective of someone with less than I had in terms of advantages. Reverend Graham, he said, I believe that someday I will see my mother again in eternity, and that is my faith. There is not a person in the room who didn't believe he had the most sincere faith commitment, even if it was not theologically perfect and accurate in some conception of faith, who didn't have an understanding. There was not a person in the room who didn't recognize that he had a profound love, obviously, for his mother. But there was also not a person in the room who didn't think he had the ability to say to a powerful person, I'm not just going to agree with you for the sake of agreement. And instead, he was a person who would maintain the integrity of his views at the same time that he sought the views of others.